Welcome to Call to the Bullpen, the podcast for executives and business leaders who want to make the right strategic decisions at the right time. I'm Jason Carvalho.
And I'm Clint Overton.
And I'm Ted Stann.
Welcome today. Before we dive in, a quick acknowledgement. Today is Canada Day, marking 157 years since Confederation. And with July 4th around the corner, I know Clint and Ted are looking forward to celebrating 249 years of U.S. independence as well. Between us, we're covering two countries and more than 4 centuries of hard-earned lessons in leadership, execution, and leverage. Which brings us to today's episode, the 100K question. What should founders actually spend on fractional leadership? This is one of the most common dilemmas we see. Founders raise 500K, $1 million, maybe $2 million, and then freeze. How do you actually build the right leadership layer with limited capital? What roles drive leverage early on, and which ones drain resources? Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, Jason.
How are both of you today?
Doing great. No, I think this is a great question, Jason. I know we're talking about this, kind of getting the conversation going today. Is there is an investment made? I mean, that could be receiving a seed round, that could be getting money from your bank, whatever it might be, and you're trying to really take your organization to the next level and trying to discern how do you use that money in the most effective way? How do you get the right ROI out of it? And talent should always be a conversation as you're elevating your business. And so the decisions around where you spend that money and you get the biggest return is a really critical decision that any leader of any business goes through in several different iterations of their company. So I think this is a great conversation. I think we're going to have a chance to talk about our own personal experiences as business leaders, and also, frame up some examples and some use cases and working examples that people might be able to think about in terms of how they might utilize their capital to expand their talent pool and accelerate their business.
So the first question we have is, why is this a 100K question? And to follow on what's really at stake when founders get fractional leadership wrong. So let's start with an open-ended. Why is this a 100K question? We specifically said 100K.
I mean, I think it starts at the 100K question and then it accelerates from there. So, just looking at the title and how we're positioning it, I think that's a minimum look at what we're talking about here. I mean, if you were to just look at, as an example, chief marketing officer, how do you look at it from a budgeting standpoint? Is that really what we need? Do we have a full-time need for a CMO? Do we need strategic advice, them leading the team, or are they ultimately going to be spending 40 hours, 60 hours a month on what truly would be required from a CMO? And if you can bring in a fractional who has experience and ultimately hand off the lower level duties to someone that can execute, getting it done, I think we look at all of those positions and say, is this a full-time job? If it's not a full-time job, how should they look at it? Are they still going to spend the same amount of money if they have a fractional and then those that are getting stuff done are underneath them? So I think there's a balance and there's a common sense look that has to be, that it is one of the ways that you have to approach the problem. And, obviously going into what does it mean from a financial standpoint? How does it help us accelerate the organization? I'm not just speaking from the marketing side, but from all of the executive positions out there. What do we need? How are we going to execute on the plan, and who's going to help us do that?
Yeah, and Jason, I know you have some thoughts on this. I know we poked a little bit of fun at you over the last quarter. You have like your quarterly theme, and so your quarterly theme that for the second quarter was ROI.
Yes, ROI.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd love for you to maybe, especially since this is like so fresh and ingrained in a lot of the focus that you've had. I know you've been talking to new founders about ROI a lot in the last quarter. But to me, human capital is just another investment decision. So it's very similar to making an investment in technology or enhancing your product or service or potentially infrastructure or being able to build a manufacturing, invest in your manufacturing plant. Like there can be so many different things around investments that you're making, and it all goes back to ROI. And so to me, talent is no different than that. So just because of the fact that I know you've been having these conversations kind of out in the field with folks who are seeking investment, I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on, what does that conversation look like?
Yeah, it's a well-framed question, ROI. I think when you think or look at those other line items that you discussed, supply chain, let's invest in some servers or some cloud technology, there's always a direct correlation. There's always an ROI out of it. We're going to make our systems faster. We're going to be able to communicate more quickly. We're going to get that product out more efficiently. And I think with fractional or executives leadership, it's very difficult to define ROI. And if you're bringing in somebody with a 20-year career in X and they have truly sat at the C-level seat and they come into an organization that's not prepared for it, you're not going to see the ROI that you want. And so as a management team, you need to be elastic. You need to define what it is that you're going to do with this individual. And you need to understand that when you do bring in a high caliber, war-torn executive who's seen this, done that, they're going to do a number of things for you. And this kind of goes back to what we always talk about at kind of operatorrevolution.com. We talk about the specifics in this, and happy for anybody to go and take a look at that podcast. But, how do you define ROI when a fractional comes in? And the ability to get to market more quickly, the ability to provide a different dimension on a problem. These are some of the conversations I've been having with founders. Some of these founders that I'm talking with, they might come from an electrical background. They might come from a physics background. They might come from a marketing background. And they may have built an amazing organization, but we all know, all three of us know, that it takes a different type of leadership team, a different type of leadership style to go from 500,000 to 1 million to 10 million to 50 million to 1 billion. And that's what founders, builders need to ask themselves is, what is the ROI? Are we going from 1 million to 10 million? Is the team that we have ready to get there? If they're not ready to get there, who do we need? I think that's when they pick up the phone and they call Boardroom Bullpen. Or is that Ghostbusters? I don't know. But yeah, I mean, Clint, throw it back to you there.
Sure.
With that being said, how do founders who've spent thousands of hours building something, sacrificing weekends, sacrificing time with their children, how do they prepare to bring in someone to take them to the next level?
No, I think it's a fair question. It's not an easy question to answer. We talked about this a little bit kind of before we kicked off the show today, just in preparation for the conversation. And one of the things that we talked about is I think there's so many different solutions out there where everything gets kind of put in a box and people say, okay, well, use this playbook for everything, or go read this book, or let's go to this presentation and it'll solve all my problems. And there's not a one size fits all out there. And so one of the things we were talking about at the beginning of the show was if you're a founder-led organization, and that might be, you might be 1 year in business, you might be 10 years in business, you might be 20 years in business, is that typically that founder might be good at some things, not as good in other things, but there's typically something that they're really great at. And as they're kind of pulling the organization along, they are generally wearing so many different hats out of necessity. And once they hit certain hurdles in the organization, I think that's when a couple things have to happen. One is just that vulnerability state of recognizing the fact that I can't do it all anymore. In order for me and the business to be successful, I've got to start thinking differently around how I execute. But the ROI question to me is a few things. So one is how can I use my time in a way where I can accelerate the business more effectively if I can spend more of my time doing X or Y? So maybe I'm a marketing expert, or maybe I'm the technical expert in the organization. Maybe I'm the organization's best salesperson. You usually talk yourself into thinking that you're the best at all those things. The reality is that you're not. And so as you elevate the business, I think it's really understanding what are the things that, from an efficiency and effectiveness standpoint, I'm spending a ton of time doing this that I can hand to somebody else who can do it in half the time that I can, a tenth of the time that I can in some cases. And then how does that then allow us to move forward more quickly in that specific function? And then how does it allow me to move the organization faster? Because now I can take all of this time I was spending in something that I'm very deficient in, and now I can actually spend more time in the areas where I can actually move the organization forward. And so for every business, that's different. Now, what I would say is that generally what I think we've seen with some level of commonality is that if the business is built on the shoulders of product and service, typically there's a technical element or an operational element or a sales element that comes around with that. The financial one is oftentimes the one that gets most overlooked. And so that, the founder has been the bookkeeper and the accountant and what have you, and then suddenly they hand it off to an office manager and they do X, Y, and Z. So I know one of the things we want to kind of get to in our conversation today too is like if I spent 100,000, and again, this is just an example, right? It's not hard and fast.
Yeah, it's not a hard number.
How could I use that money like in a really effective way? And so I did think about this a little bit. And I'd love for you guys to kind of, come at this from your personal experience, but I'm going to use an example. So if I'm really moving the business like significantly forward, that typically requires new investment in the business, strategic financial plan, really getting kind of my bookkeeping and accounting stuff straight. And so I would say that there's a very high percentage of the time where that is a place where an organization generally just does not have somebody kind of ready to go. Using our pricing model as an example, and I thought about this a bit kind of coming in the conversation today. So how could you use $100,000? Well, for bringing in a 15 or 20 year experienced CFO who's done fundraising, capital raising, bank relationships, strategic financial planning, all of those things that are really critical to propel an organization and be transformational, you get 20 hours a month out of that person, which is probably 80 or 120 or 160 hours a month for the founder and still not getting it done. So 20 hours a month, that's $6,000 a month. So over the course of a year, that's $72,000. I spend the first 6 months getting the strategic plan together, finance and accounting, like everything's like locked and loaded. Month 7, then I bring in who is that person who can accelerate another function in the business where I'm not as strong or we're deficient. So maybe it's, hey, I've been like the one-man band out there or one-woman band out there going out and doing all the sales. But now we've got to think like, what does next generation sales of this business look like? So is it just field sales? Do we need to create new funnels? Do I need to do some type of outbound effort? And so the founder maybe, as an example, like great at the field sales component, but I don't know how to build a sales team. I don't know how to build an inbound or outbound cadence. I don't know how to do these other things. So now I've spent, over the course of a year, I'm going to spend $72,000 on this fractional CFO who's really gotten us together and gets a great strategic plan and great counsel for the organization. Second half of the year, I brought in a chief revenue officer, another $6,000. So basically I'm at $108,000, roughly $100,000 in a 12-month period of time. Now I've got the table set for great revenue, marketing, and sales strategy. I've gotten everything really cooking in terms of what we're doing from a finance perspective, but it depends on your business, right? I mean, that we can kind of interchange roles, but that gives you an example of how you could, in theory, use really experienced people in a way that could really move you forward fast.
Well, I would say also to your earlier point, there is going to be expertise that CEO has, and you look at it from, a CEO that has a great sales background. So they're going to be able to structure, implement how they actually want their team to sell. When you look at the deficiencies that they have out there, I think most founders have done a little bit of every job. They've played in every discipline. But again, to your point, they ultimately need expertise that they can bring in, whether they're getting money from a bank, whether they're just trying to grow their company. And the fractional should be able to define, the executives should be able to define, okay, what are the expectations? Here's historically what we've done. Here's where we've been successful. Here's how we can help. This will help define the ROI that companies should see from the executives, whether it's a full-time executive, a fractional executive, an interim executive. That should be definable for the executives as well as the companies that they're working for.
Yeah, and just again, I'm just going to give an example, and I'd like to throw this to JC and get kind of his thoughts about this as well. But so I'm going to give. I know we're kind of jumping into the fractional piece of it, which I think is the new normal in terms of how businesses should think about how they build a team during different stages of the business. So Ted, I think brings up a very good point as well, is really trying to evaluate if I'm paying for somebody who's in a strategic CXO role, whatever that role is, how much money do you want to spend having that person doing something strategic that no one else in the company is capable of doing versus how much of their time do you want them giving to somebody who's really doing tactical execution? And so I think one of the other things that happens a lot of times when companies are in this growth mode is like, well, I'm going to go spend a bunch of money on somebody and I'm only going to get 80% of that time I'm spending like this accelerated pay schedule for somebody to do stuff that I could probably hire like 5 tactical people to do that for the same cost. So, as you're building that team, it's really going through and saying, how much strategic expertise and time commitment do I need? And then what's tactical? And then how do I build a staffing plan around that makes sense based on different stages of the business? So even when you're building out your executive team, you might say, hey, I have 3 strategic hires I need to make in the next 18 months, and 2 of them may be fractional and 1 of them may be full time, because it just depends on what your business is going through.
Yeah. And to pick up on that, like when I go into companies or have gone into companies, I love that risk matrix. And again, for listeners, the risk matrix is an exercise you run through with your executive team or owners of departments. And I won't get too tactical, but essentially it gives you a lens of like, quarterly, what are the risks of the business? And historically, fast growing companies run into the problem of lack of experience and lack of skill sets. And to your point, and to this topic of stacking fractional talent, one could look at the problem and or the ROI that one is looking to achieve at the end of the quarter and say, do we have the right team to get there, right? And this is, again, why Boardroom Bullpen was founded, is to ask yourself, do we have the right team to get there? And what do we mean by that from an ROI perspective? Do we have the right team to help lead those hires that are being brought in? Do we have the right team to help us ensure that we close that net new business to hit that quarterly ROC or ROI? Do we have the right individual? If you're an executive leader, do we have the right individual to riff with? Or, somebody can come in and, be a coach as a component to what they're doing. When you're unpacking the development of a brand new there's a learning that goes into that. It's not just the fractional comes in and creates it and goes, here you go. There's a conversation that takes place between a CEO and a founder and the rest of the executive team to explain, why did the fractional come in, to create a more customized, to your language, Clint, and to your language, Ted, more customized, say, P&L in this case. Well, we did it because the business is going through a growth phase. And these are things that we've never seen before. And so in summary, if you're listening right now, and if you've never seen something before and you have a budget, why wouldn't you look at the opportunity to go fractional? I think this goes into that founder psychology and fit, right? This only works when the founder is ready or the builder is ready. So I'll throw this out there. What behaviors do we see that kill an engagement fast?
So I guess before I'd answer that question, I would just say there's been a lot more sensitivity from founders, from CEOs, just from a expense standpoint, and the acceptance and recognition that fractional is not going away. And I think that, I think that's something that's incredibly important to recognize, that it is an industry that's growing up, obviously not at the peak at this point yet, but it is that bringing in 15 years, 20 years of experience, where fractionals aren't coming in and stubbing their toes. They're bringing real world knowledge, their 15, 20 years of experience into their assignment, and they're not being taught along the way. Of course, everybody's always learning, but they've got 90% of it when they walk through the door. And I think that's something that's important to point out when you're looking, again, at whether it's fractional, interim. The experience is key. The industry experience, absolutely key when you're looking at fractional executives, full-time executives, interim executives.
And I'll just add, before you continue on, pulling up the numbers right now, over the last 2 months, U.S. firms have announced at least 264,000 job cuts in the last 2 months. Again, not all of those are going to be executive leaders, but right now is a very interesting time where executive level leadership is, they're active, they're looking to get involved. And I know at Boardroom, that's something that we take seriously in terms of finding the right talent and constantly out there trying to recruit on behalf of our clients.
So back to absolutely. So back to how do we make sure they're successful, or what makes them not successful? The assessment process up front is key. One agreement that the role that you're telling us you need is the role that's needed out there. And then it's setting expectations. Again, I think it's fairly common sense when it comes to, again, fractional leadership, interim leadership. we go through the assessment process. We define the needs of the company, of the role. We express that to the fractional. We actually put that inside of our engagement letter. And it is the personality fit, which I would say is also key to having a great relationship, that you are open and comfortable with what you're expressing to the CEO, to the other executives in the company. So, those are just some of the keys to a successful relationship.
Yeah, and I'm going to add to that a little bit as well. I know we've used this word in some of our prior episodes as well. Vulnerability is so incredibly critical here, because generally this might be the first time in the history of the company that the CEO is bringing in somebody who, like, intellectually, experience-wise, can effectively challenge their thinking. And it's one thing to say you're ready. It's another thing to actually be ready. And I think that vulnerability is really key. I think it is difficult to pick up on an assessment clearly how ready the CEO is. I think in some cases it's very easy to find out when they're not, but it's not always easy to discern with confidence how ready they are to accept. But I'll give an example, like, to me, red flag example. And so we have a prospect that I'm working with right now, and I won't give kind of all the details, but one of the questions I asked in the conversation, so they had the CEO and the CFO, and they had another leader of their organization who was kind of a mid-level leader in another function. That specific function needs strategic leadership that mid-level manager cannot provide to the business. So that's why they're having the conversation with us. My question to the CEO was, when we bring in executive, who will they be reporting into and engaging with most significantly? Who's the lead point for them?
Point of contact, yeah.
Now, to me, the answer to that should have been the CEO, because that executive who's bringing executive leadership in a specific function that nobody in the business has to have a seat at the table. Their answer was their point of contact is the person who is the mid-level manager. And so, ding, 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 like, flashing red lights, flashing red lights. So there's a recognition. So I understand when you're ready to make that move, that person who's been there for over a decade is a respected, important part of the future of the business. But you have to be willing as a CEO to have a very difficult conversation before you even bring anybody in the first place and say, listen, you have a role for our business going forward. What you do is critical. Here's all the places that I think you're critical. Here's why we need to bring somebody in who's going to help elevate the business. This is what their role is going to be, and this is what your role is going to be, and this is how you're going to work with one another. If you're not willing to have that conversation because you're just afraid of it, or you think there's friction or what have you, you're just putting your head in the sand, and it's not going to work well. Yeah. And so I just use that as an example, and we can spin that in a number of different ways, but that goes to readiness, which is so critical. And the reality is it doesn't matter if it's fractional or interim or full-time. If you can't define roles and responsibilities, and you're not willing to have difficult conversations, and you're not willing to bring people into the fold in terms of your executive team to make joint decisions, strategic decisions together, your business is always going to be constrained.
I think just from a high level standpoint, it is you have the recognition of a deficiency in your organization, you're willing to raise your hand, and you're ready to make changes. That's how, just how I look at it very simply when talking to executive CEOs in particular.
Onboarding, managing, evaluating. So I think the summary here is you're bringing on this individual as you would bring on anybody. There's a proper onboarding. There's a proper rules and responsibilities breakdown, a job description, a breakdown of who's managing who, and how those individuals are being evaluated. And that, by default, we had here, I think, in our show notes that we were going to talk a bit about this idea of the ghost executive problem. I haven't seen a ghost executive problem in fractional. I mean, things have to be pretty screwed up, I think, to have that. I mean, you really have to not do a great job of bringing somebody outside in. But have you guys seen an example of a ghost executive or, anything like that in previous experience?
No.
Tell me, like.
Yeah, but by default, a person comes in, they're introduced to the team, again, because there's an alignment, they're being told that they're going to solve a problem, and the person shows up but isn't necessarily providing significant value because the handcuffs are on. because I think the vulnerability isn't, the wall isn't down. There's advice being provided, but it's not getting through to those that actually need it because the rules are.
No, I think that does happen because again, it goes back to the lack of readiness for the leader to have like a difficult conversation. So, I mean, we've run into this even specifically in our company where hours and hours of several meetings with CEO, I'm ready to bring a CFO in and then immediately is unwilling to communicate to the team that this person is coming in as the acting CFO and then says that they're a consultant or they're working on a project or what have you. So I think that's kind of where you're going, Jason. So yes, that can happen. It does happen. And I think that, again, the ability to take advantage of these like superior experienced resources for a business, you can't just talk the talk, you got to walk the walk. So like when you're ready to make that decision, you have to be willing to have the conversation. You have to be willing to make sure everybody understands rules and responsibilities. You have to communicate it effectively because if you don't, then it's no different than any business that's dysfunctional. Like there's a lot of people doing a lot of work, but they're not actually moving the ball down the field.
No ROI. Yeah.
I just kind of time check and thinking about a couple of things you might want to finish up in the conversation today. But one of the questions was around metrics. And so I know we talked about this early on. I would never say that there's a one fits all metric because it depends on the leader who's coming into the business. But I do think that when you make a human capital decision in your company, there should be a specific plan around I'm bringing this person in and here's the results that I expect. And so we know in 90, 120 days at the end of a year, here's things that we will accomplish that we would not have accomplished if that person was in that seat. And those things need to be very clearly defined and tracked and measured and communicated along the way. So I think there's not this is the metric 100% of the time. I think it depends on the role and the responsibility. But I do think for it to be successful, again, if it's fractional, interim, or full-time, you have to have a plan for that person. You have to have specific outcomes that you expect, and you have to be able to measure success.
And those outcomes obviously are agreed upon with the executive. I think a lot of times when you bring in an executive and there has not been an executive in that seat prior to bringing someone in, a lot of that looks like heavy lifting to the organization because they haven't had a leader in place there. I think when you talk to the executives themselves, a lot of what they do in the first 90 to 180 days is really what I'd consider low-hanging fruit. And so they end up looking like rock stars, which they should. I mean, they've got the historical experience for it, and they recognize the benefit, fairly quickly when you're bringing in that executive. So that's just something that I think is important. It's something that is old hat to executives that have been in the workforce, and it makes them look like geniuses when they walk through the door and they execute on that plan.
I'd say whether you're a startup founder, just starting your first company, and you've had a long career, maybe in science, engineering, whatever it might be, or you've been at this for a decade, you know your business inside and out. I think for me, the kind of unseen metric is when this fractional comes in, do you get your time back? It's very important, right? Because I think if that person you brought in is in the right seat, and to our earlier comments, you're running everything, do you have a new job description now? Do you have your time back? And a secondary, metric would be, is the fractional that's working in your organization, how many conversations have they had with team members? Do they have access? So would the amount of feedback you're getting from your team be a potential metric in the early stages, to your point, when they're kind of coming in and doing an audit and just, getting the lay of the land? And are you getting feedback from your team members saying, oh, wow, this person came in and really, supported me on this and really unpack that? I think, again, not to get super tactical, but if you're hearing that, you're getting your time back, you're getting more time to think about the things that you need to think about. I think, that's something that is a positive. I think you're on the right track.
Yeah. And just a couple of quick things as we're kind of moving towards the conclusion of the show today. I would just say too, that this goes back to the vulnerability and readiness point, Jason. So if you theoretically are getting your time back, how are you using the time that you're getting back? So are you ready to actually shift your routine? Because what's happening in a lot of these cases is people have gotten into these very long-standing routines that they've been doing rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat for years. Yeah. And then now it's like, okay, well, now I have 10 extra hours a week to do something else. And so are they using that 10 hours wisely in the right places? So was there a plan, not only for this person who's coming into the executive seat, but was there a specific plan around how I'm going to use the time that I now have available to me? Because it's not just about having the time, it's how you use that time. And I think that, back to that readiness, are you really using that time? Do you have a plan for that time? Are you holding yourself accountable to using that time? Or are you just looking over the shoulder of the person you just brought in for that 10 hours a week to make sure that they're doing the way you would do it?
Yes.
And if that's the case, like if you're just trying to find somebody else to do it your way, don't hire that person.
Yeah.
Because that's not the value proposition to them.
Just get a photocopier.
That's right. That's right. And then just, I think maybe just kind of some of the final takeaways I'd love to hear kind of from all of us on this as we're wrapping up today. But, going back to the question around how would you spend your money? We kind of led off like early in the conversation. What's the vision of the business? What's the strategic plan? What are you trying to do in the next year? What are the things that are in the way? What leadership deficiencies or gaps do you have? And then I would just say staging in that leadership in a way that is something that can assimilate into the business without causing some friction, but not disruption. And so what I mean by that is if you say, hey, I need 3 seats, don't bring 3 executives into the team like tomorrow and expect that if you've never done it before. Start with the one that's most impactful in the area that has the most challenge, create stabilization, come with role number 2. And then again, it's all about building the right talent. So gents, any parting comments from you, Ted or Jason around that?
JC?
Are you throwing it to me?
Yeah, I'm throwing it to you first.
So let's rephrase the question. So if I had 100K, where am I putting that capital?
That's my take on it.
Yeah. Okay. It's a crazy time right now in the markets. The economies are changing quickly. The rules to how economics works in the United States, Canada, globally are changing. And if I have a company that has to hit some very significant technical milestones, revenue generated milestones, ops milestones, I would essentially review which of those 3 are priority. I would then go and find a trusted partner to find someone that can help us achieve, let's just say in this case, a technical milestone, bring that person in, get an ROI out of them and see what the long-term possibilities of them are working with the team. And I would really, again, realize that time is money. And if you have everything on your plate right now, that is not an efficient way to run a business. If you want to be a serious leader, you have to take executive leadership seriously.
Looking specifically at your area that you are most challenged in, we talk about deficiency. I think when you're looking at it from an executive standpoint, what is going to help us? And I know I always default to the CFO mindset, but is cash flow your biggest issue? Is sales your biggest issue? Is churn your biggest issue? And then identifying the right leader to bring in and assist with that. And it may not be an executive at all. It may be someone that's, mid-level manager that can solve a problem that you're trying to fix. But, ultimately, it's looking at, we've got this problem area. We need to solve this problem. To Clint's earlier point, probably have more than one problem, probably have 3, 5, 100 problems out there. But let's identify the one that we can fix immediately, the one that's going to be most impactful to the business. If it requires re-identifying that after you fix those problems, great. But yeah, let's address what we can and let's do it in a very formulated fashion. So that would be my take on where I'd spend 100K.
That's a wrap on this episode of Call to the Bullpen. If today gave you something to think about, a smarter way to build your team, spend your capital, or just avoid a painful mistake, do us a favor. Subscribe to the show, share it with a founder or operator you trust, and leave a quick review in our comments, either on YouTube or on our podcast, wherever you download it from. It helps more people to find these conversations. We appreciate you. For more insights, frameworks, and operator playbooks, check out boardroombullpen.com or follow us on LinkedIn and X. For more insights, frameworks, and operator playbooks, check us out on boardroombullpen.com. Follow us on LinkedIn. I'm Jason Carvalho.
And I'm Clint Overton.
And I'm Ted Stann.
And we'll see you next time.